Well, why is it we're examining critical race theory? Well, critical race theory is not something that's new, but it is shaping public policy and public discourse on race debates very much at the moment. And it has been doing for some decades. Perhaps critical race theory was brought to prominence, particularly as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement protests after the tragic death of George Floyd, protests in America that then were replicated in Europe and many other places around the world. Many schools, sort of businesses, organizations, public bodies have begun to seek to address issues of racism and to provide anti-racism training that draws on the thinking of critical race theory, introducing concepts like subjective bias, the idea of white kind of privilege, other elements of critical race theory discourse. Really, a critical race theory is all about the nature of racism in contemporary society, and particularly in a contemporary American society. The Black Lives Matter movement brought it to great prominence, perhaps particularly amongst evangelical Christians, who perhaps had not paid much attention to critical race theory before. And it has become hugely divisive, both within society more widely, but also particularly amongst evangelical Christians. As people have sought to wrestle with critical race theory, some have taken the view, some amongst evangelical Christians have taken the view that it represents a dangerous Marxist ideology, a false gospel that needs to be rejected. In the US at present, there are 25 states that either have or are considering banning the teaching of critical race theory, CRT, in public schools. Others have taken the view that there are lessons that evangelicals need to learn from critical race theory, that although we might not adopt it wholeheartedly, it can be a useful analytical tool to help us to understand the nature of racism. There's huge infighting at the moment within, for example, the Southern Baptist Convention in America over the place of CRT. The convention adopted a motion which recognized the limitations of CRT, but saw it as a potentially useful analytical tool. And there has been a kind of a backlash and reaction against that by those who think that CRT is a false gospel that must be rejected and is dangerous to the church. So that's really the question we're trying to address, whether or not CRT can be used as a useful analytical tool, or whether it's a dangerous false teaching. I'm conscious as we begin to think about this, that this is a huge subject, and it's also an emotive subject. And even a webinar that lasts for 3 hours isn't really able to do justice to the subject. And of course, it's especially emotive for those who are from Black or ethnic minority communities, because CRT seeks to describe and explain the oppression and the injustice and the unfairness that they feel. I'm conscious that in speaking about this issue, I'm a white male European. And so I hope that I'm going to be able to approach with humility. One of the claims of CRT is that we have to listen primarily to the voices of those who are oppressed. Whilst it's certainly right that we do need to listen to those voices, as evangelical Christians who believe that all of us as human beings are made in the image of God, and that the basis of our authority is God's word that has been revealed, we believe that actually we can all comment on movements and ideologies and what's happening in our world. But we do need to do that with a due humility. I'm also very aware that this is the European Leadership Forum, and the European context is, I think, very different to the context in the United States. Many European countries practiced colonialism, and adopted racist policies in relation to their colonies. But they had very small ethnic populations in their home countries. That has changed dramatically since the Second World War, as ethnic minorities have migrated to Europe, so that many European countries now have significant Black and ethnic minorities. But those populations are people who chose voluntarily to migrate to European countries. In the United States, the situation is different in that the Black population in the United States is largely present as a result of the consequences of race-based slavery that wasn't abolished until the end of the Civil War, towards the middle of the second half of the 19th century. In America, the claims of CRT is that the whole nation was constructed from the very beginning on a racist basis, and that continues to be the case today. So there is a fundamental difference between the European and the American context in relation to race issues, particularly regarding the Black community. And it would be all too easy to see critical race theory as being an issue primarily relevant to America. But it seems to me that critical race theory is relevant to Europe for a number of reasons. It's relevant because of the influence of American culture on European culture. It's relevant because the Black community in Europe may feel solidarity with the Black community in America, and therefore feel that they are facing the same issues. And the analysis that is being used in America is just as relevant to describe their experience. It's also perhaps particularly relevant to European evangelicals, because we're so influenced by American evangelical teaching, American evangelical theologians, simply because of the scale of American evangelicalism. But more than that, I think that critical race theory has much wider application, because some of the fundamental principles of critical race theory concern the way that majority groups treat minority groups. And irrespective of issues of color, many European countries have significant minority ethnic groups that make up part of their population. That may well be migrant groups, or it may well be different language groups, different cultural groups within the European countries. And some of the principles of CRT are just as relevant to describing the way that those minorities are treated within European countries. Because CRT really addresses the question of what equality is and what social justice means. So that's why we're going to be thinking about this subject. And as we look at those issues, I hope that it will help us to see more clearly what the gospel is. So what's my aim as we undertake this webinar? Well, my aim is to try to help us to understand critical race theory, because only if we understand it can we evaluate it and critique it. And I want to try to understand it on its own terms and to look at it in its best light. One of the mistakes Christians can often make is to critique ideologies or other views by looking at an extreme caricature, rather than trying to look at them in the best light on their own terms. That's what I'm going to try to do. And then I want to, after we've tried to understand CRT, to evaluate and critique it, using both secular but also Christian critiques, and examining what secular and Christian thinkers have said. When we approach those critiques, as far as is possible, I've tried to listen to Black voices that are critiquing critical race theory. I think it's especially helpful to listen to those from the Black community who are questioning some of the premises and outworkings of CRT. So my aim is to try to represent fairly But inevitably, that always means that I will have to simplify. But I hope I'm not going to offer simplistic answers. And it's not my aim in these webinars to rush to judgment. We need to take the time to try to understand before we can evaluate, critique, and draw some conclusions. And of all the sessions that I'm going to be speaking at this afternoon, it's really the last one that looks at how the gospel that addresses racism that I think is by far the most important. Because above all else, we want to know, what does the gospel tell us we should do in relation to issues of race? So hopefully we will climax by thinking about a gospel perspective on these issues. So that's where we're going. I'm not aware of most of you and what you know about CRT. Some of you may well have engaged extensively with CRT and done lots of reading. You might find some of what I say is therefore kind of already well known to you. Some of you might be relatively new, and I want to try to help you to understand what are the key principles. So here in this first session, I want to start by thinking about what CRT is. What is critical race theory? Well, critical race theory is essentially a theory about race power dynamics in society. It's about the way that race and the power between different racial groups works within wider society. And the essence, in many ways, of critical race theory, as it's been developed in the United States, is that the white majority exercises cultural and social power in a way that disadvantages the Black minority. So it's all about the power, the cultural and social power exercised in society by the white majority to the disadvantage of the Black minority. To put that in more technical terms, the white majority are said to have a hegemony, which simply means a social dominance that inevitably oppresses the Black minority. So the sheer power associated with being the majority has an impact for those who live, in effect, under that majority cultural rule. And the claim of critical race theory is that true social justice and equality hasn't been achieved in society simply through equality before the law. In American society and in most European societies, racism was a tragic fact in the past, but laws have been changed to bring an end to discrimination and inequality. So in America, slavery has been abolished, and then the civil rights movement removed segregation and discrimination. In most European contexts, the kind of European Convention on Human Rights and European law has the effect of outlawing discrimination on the basis of colour or race. But the claim of critical race theory is that simply ensuring equality before the law for all people, irrespective of their race, doesn't accomplish justice and equality. Because racial power imbalances in society result in numerous disadvantages for the minority Black community. Disadvantages in education, healthcare, housing, income, and rates of incarceration within the criminal justice system. So they might enjoy equality before the law in a technical sense, but there is still massive disadvantage because of the way that racial power is used. And the argument of CRT is the Black community experiences these disparities. It doesn't enjoy actual equality, not equality of outcome, for the reason that the whole system is rigged against them. The claim of CRT is that the system is essentially constructed in order to ensure the maintenance of the subordination of the Black community. And so CRT claims that if true equality and justice is to be achieved, then the entire system needs to be transformed and overthrown in order to end oppression. So that's what critical race theory is, and we'll be looking at some of the language of critical race theory and how that works out in one of the subsequent presentations. But briefly, where does critical race theory come from? Where does this theory derive from? Well, critical race theory has its origins in the work of legal academics. It was originally developed by legal scholars out of an area of work called critical legal theory. The idea of critical legal theory is that although the law claims to be objective and neutral, in fact, the law and the legal system and the criminal justice system, critical legal theory claims, builds in all kinds of biases and prejudices that protect powerful groups, that ensures sort of that those who enjoy greater social and cultural power continue to maintain it. So law is not neutral in the way that it claims to be. And critical race theory was an offshoot of critical legal theory. The term was coined in 1989 as a result of a workshop that was held at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. One of the key academics behind that symposium was Kimberly Crenshaw, but also Neil Gatanda and Stephanie Phillips. But the work of critical race theory in this legal area goes back to the work of Derek Bell, who was a civil rights campaigner and a professor at Harvard Law School. And essentially, critical race theory sought to explain the disparities, the inequalities in the justice system. So law is essentially a social practice which purports to be objective. But the evidence demonstrated that law was being used to subordinate the Black community. So some of the indications that were seen for that were higher incarceration levels in prison for those from the Black community, longer sentences for the same offences for people who were from the Black community, disparities in the application of the death penalty, inequality in the quality of legal representation that was provided for Black defendants. A classic example of this kind of disparity within the legal system was the so-called war on drugs that was inaugurated in the 1980s in America, when there was increasing legal action taken against those who had drugs. So more offences were introduced, sentences were made more severe. And the result is that a very large number of the Black community were imprisoned as a result of this so-called war on drugs. So there was greater incarceration in the American system. That then leads to disenfranchisement of voting rights. And the argument was that this was a kind of a form of oppression, because white crimes were being treated differently, and white people were not being criminalized in the same way. So, for example, drug-related deaths within the Black community were treated very differently from drink driving deaths that took place within the white community, even though the number of drink driving deaths was significantly higher. So those are the origins of critical race theory. They were really about the way that the legal system fails to do real justice because of those inbuilt biases. Now, critical legal theory and critical race theory have their origins in other movements. So they go back to particularly Marxism in the 19th century. The fundamental kind of analysis of critical race theory owes its shape to the work of Karl Marx. Marx taught that society was unjust because of the economic oppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie. And in Marxist thinking, the proletariat conspire in their own oppression, forgive me, because they have a false consciousness and are kept content. That false consciousness needs to be exposed and dispelled by the reality of their oppression. And then Marx teaches that out of that, a workers' revolution will occur that will establish the kind of utopia of true equality as the oppression and the rule of the bourgeoisie is overthrown. Now, for Marx, his theory was seen as being, in his mind, a scientific truth. And this was the path that history would take. And therefore, the task was to encourage the revolution of the workers. Well, Marx's theories developed in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, it didn't work out in the way that Marx and his followers had expected. And so critical theory was a response to the failure of Marxist hopes. The only revolution that took place was in Russia, and that very quickly became a tyranny. Germany and Italy, where Marxist theorists had thought that there would be a workers' revolution, instead, the workers turned to fascism and nationalism. And the question was, why? So a number of kind of Marxist intellectual scholars began to think that the problem was more than simply economic. For Marx, the fundamental problem was economic and material. But subsequent scholars came to see that the problem was bigger than that. And they pointed to the presence of hegemonies in the culture that sustained oppression. And that therefore, if true liberation were to come, these hegemonies needed to be overthrown. They included all kinds of authority within society, the family, the power of religion, sort of traditional sexual morality. And these kind of powers were constructed and enforced norms of behavior that oppressed people, that prevented people from being their authentic selves. And this power was maintained by popular culture. And popular culture was seen as being simply propaganda for the oppressive status quo. So out of this thinking emerged critical theory. And critical theory was essentially a vision for the transformation of society. The way that society was to be transformed and freedom and justice were to be brought about were that these oppressive norms were to be overthrown. And therefore, those who held the social power and the cultural power also needed to be overthrown. That critical theory is associated with those who are described as the Frankfurt School, really working from the late 1920s through into the 1970s. Sometimes that critical theory is often dubbed cultural Marxism, especially by its critics, because it essentially takes some of the principles of Marxism and works them out in relation to wider culture. And it doesn't take much to recognize that that way of thinking has been hugely influential in Western society, especially since the 1960s. As traditional values, traditional understandings of the family and of sexual relationships have been overthrown in favor of liberal progressivism. And it's out of this kind of view of cultural sort of Marxism critical theory that the whole idea of identity politics emerges. People are categorized by their identities as either oppressors or oppressed, as either perpetrators or victims. So people seek to fight for the liberation of their particular identity. That has come to be subsumed in more popular culture as being kind of woke culture. The woke movement is seen as a sort of the outworkings of this kind of critical theory. Those who are woke are casting off the oppressions of the past and seeking to remake what they believe to be a fairer and a more equitable society. And as I said right at the beginning, one of the manifestations of this has been the Black Lives Matter movement, which came to prominence after the death of George Floyd. It was actually founded in 2013 after the acquittal of George Zimmerman for the shooting of Trayvon Martin. And it was a protest against police violence against members of the Black community. But in fact, the Black Lives Matter movement had a broader agenda than that. And it reflected the broader agenda of critical theory. So the stated objectives of the Black Lives Matter movement also included deconstructing the traditional family and promoting kind of gay and transgender rights. And that's one of the reasons why Christians have found it difficult sometimes to support the Black Lives Matter movement as a movement, because they felt that in supporting Black Lives Matter, they're agreeing not just to seeking to end police violence against members of the Black community, but to buy into that wider understanding of critical theory and the overturning of hegemonies that are thought to be oppressive within contemporary society. So I hope that's given something of an overview of what critical race theory is and where it comes from. It's come out of the legal world, out of critical legal theory. It's an offshoot of critical theory, which seeks to recreate or seeks to bring about a fairer, a more equitable, a more just society by overthrowing cultural forms of oppression.